Well, that's what Hebrews 12 is. It starts in verse 18. It's a view of our final destination, the wonderful city that we're headed towards, and what awaits all of us who have experienced the miracle of complete forgiveness. And we find in these few verses the precious realities of what God's complete forgiveness is based on. And what is the final word? In fact, you'll find out when we get to the end of this little section that the last thing that's mentioned is the blood that cries forgiveness. We in heaven are never going to be able to forget that we're forgiven. And I think that's why the Lord said those great words, that he that has been forgiven little loves little, and the one who's been forgiven much loves much. We are never going to forget how much we've been forgiven of. But let's go through this, what we're going to have. And I'll start reading in verse 18 of Hebrews 12. But you have not come to the mountain that may be touched, and that burned with fire, into blackness and darkness and tempest, verse 18. Verse 19, and to the sound of a trumpet. He's talking about the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai in Exodus. And to the sound of the trumpet and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them anymore. For they could not endure that was commanded. And if so much as a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned or shot with an arrow. Verse 21, and so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I am exceedingly afraid and trembling. So that's Sinai. That's 3,500 years ago. Now he fast forwards. The writer of Hebrews fast forwards. And we get to verse 22. Now imagine, just think the context of what we're reading. This is the writer of Hebrews, inspired by the Spirit of God, to write to us, the church, and be given this word from God. And this is the most amazing description of what the recipients of God's complete forgiveness get to experience and they get to possess. And it's just wonderful. I'm going to try and zip through it, but there's so much here. These are the precious realities. Number one, finally, we the forgiven will enter the city we've been looking for with foundations. That's what it says in verse 22. But you have come to Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of the living God. Those who are completely forgiven get to come to the city of the living God. The longing of our hearts is throughout our earthly lives we were pilgrims and strangers, always waiting and looking for this city that God was preparing for us, finally is our reality. Now it's interesting what he calls it. You have come to Mount Zion. Now 46 of us just a couple weeks ago were in Mount Zion. But he's not talking about the earthly one. Mount Zion was the location of the city, remember, of Melchizedek. That's Genesis 14. That's where his city was. It was also the place called Mount Moriah that Abraham came to in chapter 21 and 22 of Genesis, the sacrifice of Isaac. It's also the Jebusite stronghold that David captured. And when David brought the Ark of the Covenant to the place he made in Jerusalem, that became the spiritual center of God's kingdom. And when that Ark of the Covenant came there, Jerusalem became the hub that all of God's people looked to for their fellowship with God, the place where God's presence with his people would be. Later, Solomon built a temple there on Mount Zion and installed the ark, and Zion and Jerusalem became representative of where God dwelt. And remember, his glory cloud, the Shekinah, would be over, and at the dedication of the temple, that glory filled the place, and all the way through Ezekiel, we see that glory cloud hovering there. And as believers, we realize that though that was an earthly representation of God's presence, that there was a heavenly reality, because by the time we get to Philippians 3:20, Paul reminds us that we, while we walk on earth, are already citizens of the heavenly city. We're citizens of heaven. So while we're here on earth, and Americans or whatever citizenship people hold, we have dual citizenship, and we're citizens of heaven. And that this temple tabernacle time of the Old Testament was just an earthly picture of a reality in heaven, that those who by faith believe in God have their citizenship there. And so Paul tells us the privileges of our citizenship in heaven are already ours. That's Philippians 3:20. He goes beyond that. In Ephesians, not only are we citizens of heaven, in Philippians 3:20, but Ephesians, this is what Paul says, as believers, we're already citizens of the heavenly Jerusalem. And we are those who have already been seated, as it were, at the banquet table with Jesus, because our position with Him is so complete. That's Ephesians 2:7 and 6, where it says we're raised up with Jesus, seated with Him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus, and it goes through that incredible description of our positions. So when he says right here in verse 22 of Hebrews 12 that you have come to Mount Zion, the Mount Zion of Melchizedek and Abraham and David and Solomon was just an earthly representation of the heavenly city where we're in God's presence. And we are already there. Paul tells us we're already seated at the banquet table. So Paul, as we follow after and keep slogging through life, as hard as it is through the trenches, he says we're following after the reason we were apprehended, and we're pressing toward the goal. And the goal is to be with Him and to enjoy His presence forever. And so the first thing we see in Hebrews 12 is that we, like Paul, who have followed after, arrive at our goal through the upward call of Jesus Christ. And it says, you have come. Now, it doesn't say will. It says you have. Hebrews 12. That's just, if you look closely at the words of Hebrews 12:22, it is such a blessing to think about. He says, you have. You're already there. Now, it's the reality we're anticipating by faith. But all the work has been done. All the paperwork. It's signed and sealed and delivered. It's paid for. It's our reality. So finally, we the forgiven will get to enter the city with foundations that we've longed for.